Rust on the Razor, Tom and Scott series, Book 6. Author, Mark Richard Zubero. Publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 10. Hiram grinned. I began a protest. Scott looked furious. Cody simply twisted his head to the radio attached to his shoulder and said, "He's here. I need backup to take him in." Scott said to me, "Hiram wouldn't kill anybody." To Cody, he said, "You can't arrest Tom. He didn't kill anybody." Cody repeated, "You're under arrest." His backup arrived moments later. I didn't struggle. Cody pulled handcuffs off the belt that surrounded his narrow hips. I wanted to throttle him. He was impervious to any questions we tried to ask. He patted me down for weapons, and I wound up with my hands cuffed behind my back, being hustled downstairs. At the exit, Scott tried to hug me, but they yanked me away. 3 cop cars waited in the parking lot. 2 cops and I crossed the few feet between car and overhang. Through the rain, they opened the car door for me, and I stooped down. Cody put his hand on top of my head so I wouldn't bang it against the roof. Scott called, "I'll get you out." The door slammed, and I was inside. I looked back and saw Violet rushing across the parking lot, trying toward her car. I saw Scott waving his finger in his brother's face. He seemed to be angrily berating him, but I couldn't make out the words. Cody and an older cop I didn't recognize sat in the front. I asked questions through the screen. The older cop told me to shut up. I did. I watched as Violet's car pulled out behind us and followed. If I'd known any of the lyrics to "Marching Through Georgia," I'd have sung them. If I'd known even the tune, I'd have hummed it, and probably would have been shot on the spot. Minutes later, they led me into the lynching emporium. They called it jail. The interior of the jail smelled of damp and mold, excrement, and urine. No air conditioning. The tiny slits that served as windows in the first room we entered were all open. I heard the rain rushing off the roof. Strips of mask tape above the desk stayed absolutely still. Not the slightest breeze. The tape was covered with black specks, ersatz flypaper. "I get a phone call?" I said. "No calls." They brought me across a 5-foot entryway to a large counter that stretched 9/10 of the way across the room, blocking the way into the back. The last 10th was on the right, a barred doorway. A white woman with her gray hair tied back in a bun pulled out a large manila envelope from the top drawer of the desk she was sitting at. She didn't wear a uniform. She brought the envelope to the counter and said, "Put his belongings in here." And they took my wallet, change, car keys, handkerchief, watch, and pen and placed them in the bag. Then they undid my belt, pulled it out, and shoved it in the envelope. Cody untied my shoelaces and placed them in the receptacle. On a sheet of paper, the woman listed everything they placed inside. She opened my wallet and inventoried the contents on a different sheet of paper. When she was finished, she sealed the envelope and tossed it on top of a desk behind her. "Do I get to know the charge?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered. "No calls, no charge. I want my lawyer." They didn't yell, scream, or carry on. They mumbled a few simple commands, but said nothing else. This frightened me. My shoes flapped on my feet as they led me through the barred doorway. The area behind the counter had 3 desks filled with the knickknacks, pictures of kids, and piles of papers you'd expect on a bureaucrat's desk. The door we met was solid steel with a 3x5-inch sliding panel in it. Cody pressed a buzzer on the right. The panel slid open, and 2 eyes looked out, moved from left to right, and disappeared. The panel closed, and seconds later the door swung open. A step or 2 further, a creak of a hinge as the door shut, and I was in. To the left was a desk with a lamp and an open newspaper spread out on top of it. An older African-American cop pulled out a large ring filled with keys. He selected a small silver one and unlocked another metal door, this one without a peephole. The cops exchanged minimal greetings, but I was not disgusted in the least. It was as if I was expected, and they all knew their roles. I felt like an actor who'd walked into the wrong play. I didn't try to yell, shout, scream, or fight. They had the upper hand. I knew it. They knew it, and this moment, fighting was useless. The next room was long and rectangular, and I guessed it must stretch the rest of the length of the jail. On the right, where we stood, it was a broad hallway, 8 feet across. The cells were on the left. We walked past 8 empty ones before coming to a 9th. The old cop selected another key, unlocked the door, and swung it open. They unlocked the handcuffs. Cody placed a hand on my shoulder and directed me inside. No one had been violent. No one had been cruel. No one had yelled or tried to intimidate me. They had treated me like a thing, and that scared me. They left. Riveted to the wall of the cell was an iron toilet with no seat. The bed had a frame bolted to the floor. I looked under the 1/8-inch thick mattress. The slats were welded to the frame. I looked back the way I'd come. Nobody. There was one more cell in the row. Lack of x-ray vision prevented me from seeing through the gray cinder block walls into the cells on either side. "Anybody there?" I called. Silence. None of the cells I'd seen had windows. Dim illumination shone from a fluorescent light over the door at the far end. Did they turn on more lights in the morning, or was it always eternally gloomy in here? I could hear the rain on the roof and nothing else. I lay back on the mattress. First, I decided to give my situation a good, solid worry. Then I opted for a healthy bout of self-pity. If you can't feel sorry for yourself, he's going to do it for you. And frankly, who but yourself is better at feeling sorry for yourself? I worried about Scott and his dad. I knew Scott would be doing everything he could to get me out of here. I hoped for a visit from Beauregard Lee, the lawyer from Atlanta, or any other form of rescue. They'd have to give me some kind of hearing eventually. Scott, lawyers, press, somebody would be able to help me. I hoped Violet was outside now, doing what she could, although I doubted if all her southern charms would be enough to huff and puff and blow this house of bricks down. The heat was miserable. Damp clung to every inch of my body. I'd been in the middle of pouring rain and putrid humidity so long by now, I felt like I'd been immersed in a pool of peppered water. I couldn't see any visible vermin on the mattress, but I didn't take my clothes off to lie down. There was no pillow. I lay and sweated, then sweated some more. I tried standing, gave pacing a shot, took a whirl on, bellowing angrily at the top of my lungs. The light stayed on, the rain fell, and nobody responded. Angry thoughts mixed with helplessness and rage as I lay back down. I tried thinking of all the nastiest tortures I would like to inflict on the dumber denizens of Bernard County. Finally, I fell asleep to the fall of the rain. I woke up to thunder sometime later. I listened to it and felt somehow comforted. They could try and do any number of things to me, but nature would be stronger than any of us. I don't know why this soothed me, but it did. I fell back to sleep almost immediately. At first, I couldn't tell what woke me next. I blinked at the ceiling. The amount of light was the same. The cracks and lines hadn't altered. I realized 2 things. First, the rain had stopped, or was falling too lightly to register on the roof. The second was more ominous. The place stunk worse than it had. I looked down. Water swirled on the floor. It had risen about 2 inches on the frame. I stirred on the bed. "Hey!" I shouted. I couldn't see where the water was coming from, but it was brown and unhealthy looking. I bellowed loudly and angrily and continuously until my throat was raw. After I exhausted this useless option, I checked the water again. 4 inches up the frame, I banged my hands on the wall and ceiling. I heard a brief a sizzle, and the lights winked out. Total darkness. A couple of thoughts struck me. They were trying to drown me, and turning out the lights was extra torture. What made me hesitate in this conclusion was that the lights hadn't gone out as if someone was shutting them off. Plus, how could they flood 10 feet of room floor to ceiling? Maybe I wasn't being killed deliberately. Maybe I was being totally forgotten. A major panic seemed in order. I know I'm an ex-Marine and I like to think I'm tough, but although it certainly isn't macho, I was scared witless. I'm not proud of what I did for the next few minutes, but I'm not ashamed either. It just happened. For an unknown amount of time, I lost all sense of proportion and my own humanity, hammering until my fists were bloody and screaming on tortured vocal cords. I let loose with every ounce of rage in my body. No response. I knelt on the bed frame and drew deep breaths. I must have crouched there for some time, or the water was rising swiftly because dampness on my knees startled me. Rationality slowly returned. I stepped into the water. It came to just below my knees. I couldn't think about the filth I was walking in. In the dark, I felt behind me for the bed. Methodically, I yanked at the frame and the slats, stuck solid to wall and floor. Putting my hands in front of me, I moved to the bars, and on each one in turn I twisted, pounded, pulled, slapped, and yanked, but they moved not an inch. Darkness totally surrounded me. Not an outlet or way of saving myself came to mind. I shouted again. I thought I heard a response. I bellowed louder. Definitely voices responding. I thought I heard the creak of a door hinge. Dim light entered the room. "Tom!" a voice called. "Violet?" I couldn't see to the doorway, but I thought I recognized her voice. "Tom! Get me out of here!" I yelled. I could see the water eddy and swirl. Pockets of filth spun by. I heard sloshing. Cody came into view. He was holding on to Violet, who had a rope tied around her waist. "I told you he was in here," Violet said. Cody said, "Wainwright Richardson told me you'd been moved. We've got to hurry." Violet wore hip-waiter boots and a jacket zipped to her throat. Her hair was soaked. "Thank you for coming," I said. Cody wore unbuckled knee-high boots. His pants were soaked to the crotch. A red and yellow striped emergency jacket covered his uniform shirt. He fumbled with the key ring, tried 4 different ones before the lock clicked. "Hang on to Violet," he said. "If the building goes while we're in here, just hold on." He grabbed the rope and began walking hand over hand back the way they had come. I clutched the rope tightly and imitated his gestures. Violet came behind. The doors to the front were open, and I could see gray outdoor lights. Chunks of raw sewage drifted by my legs in the water, which was now halfway up my thigh. In the doorway, I saw a boat with men in the same red and yellow striped jackets as Cody. One of them had the other end of the rope tied around him, while another held the throttle for the motor of the boat. "Hurry!" a man in his 50s called. The building seemed to tilt around me. Cody splashed through the counter door. I heard the building groan. The 3 of us pulled ourselves through the vile fluid. Out the front door, I looked back for Violet. "Go!" she ordered. In the water outside, I could feel my feet beginning to be swept away by the torrent. The current sucked away my laceless shoes. I clutched the rope. Hands grabbed me and lifted me into the boat. Cody, Violet, and I sat in the middle of a 12-foot craft. As soon as we were in, the motor roared louder and we pulled away from the building. The jail slowly turned sideways, drifted in the current. For a minute, collapsed on itself, and then was swept away. I felt occasional raindrops on my head. I looked around. The water was at the base of the courthouse. A cop car was covered by water up to its Mars lights. The water had reached the first-floor windows of the police station. I gazed back at the river itself as the boat neared the new bank. I saw swing sets, yard furniture, tires, and tree limbs swish past in the mud-dark water. The creek was at least 50 feet across by now, and one of the deeper parts of the top of a truck was sweeping by, along with logs, branches, and a whole trees. Revolving and dipping in the mud, we arrived 10 feet from Della's Barbecue, stepped out of the boat into water up to our knees, and were pulled to dry land by a number of hands. 40 or 50 people stood on the bank. 4 or 5 of them had video cameras recording the destruction. "Thank you again," I said to Violet and Cody. He shrugged. A kid about 10 rushed up to me with a pair of knee-high boots. He clutched 3 other pairs in his left hand. "Here, mister," he said. "We got these for everybody." I thanked him. He dashed off to his next person. Violet said, "You probably saw me follow you. They refused to answer any of my questions. I went back and forth between the police station, the jail, and the hospital for hours. Scott and I placed about 1,000,000 calls last night, so did your lawyer in Chicago and the one in Atlanta. It was impossible to get you out in the middle of the night. We couldn't even get an answer about why they arrested you. We inched back from the edge as the water continued to rise. Violet continued. When I came back this time, there was no one in the jail and the keys were gone. The water was up to the doorway. I ran to the police station, but no one would listen. I finally found Cody and made him look. Am I still under arrest? I asked her. I don't know. I didn't ask. We turned to Cody. Violet put her hand on his arm. Richardson wanted him dead, and you know it. That's murder. Maybe he thought someone moved him. Do you believe that? He shrugged. A truck pulling a boat turned into the square from the dry end. It halted several feet from us and turned, so that the boat slowly entered the water. One of the emergency workers in the cab yelled, Come on, Cody! This is the last boat to be found. We've got to move on those folks north of town in the trailer park. Cody hesitated, looked around for assistance. Violet said, He can't go anywhere. The town's cut off. He can help load sandbags at the hospital. You know Richardson tried to kill him. Tom didn't hurt anyone. Let's move, Cody. People are hurting real bad. We'll get answers to these questions later, Cody said and hurried off. A large snake slithered out of the water. One of the people standing near the edge grabbed a sandbag from a small pile and crushed the animal. Why aren't they building a levee? I asked. Not enough sandbags in the county, Violet said. They've never had a flood like this. Highest the water ever got before was up to the jail back last century. They're keeping the sandbags to try and save the water treatment plant and the hospital and a few other places. Can they evacuate Scott's father? The town's cut off. Help can't get in or out. The roads are completely flooded. They have an emergency helicopter from Macon. Don't know how soon it could get here. When the storm lifts up some more, it'll be used for rescuing stranded people. No place can send more help. It's awful for miles around. Can we still get to the hospital? No one challenged my walking away, getting into Vida's car and driving off down the road. Rain seems to have lit up, I said. We've had at least 15 inches. If it hadn't been so dry in the first place, we'd probably all have floated away already. They evacuated as many people in town as they could overnight. How long was I in the jail? About 6 hours. Water came faster than anybody imagined. Will it overrun the whole town? I hope not. About 300 people clustered in the hospital parking lot. I saw Hiram, Shannon, Nathan, and Mary, along with Clara Thornton, Wainwright, Richardson, and Al Holcomb. Inside the hospital, the lights were dim, but still working. We took the stairs up. The air conditioning was off, but the hospital was not yet uncomfortable. Scott was in the hall with his mom. He hurried to me. You smell awful, he said. He embraced me tightly. How'd you get out? I told him the story of my incarceration and rescue. When I finished, I got another fierce hug. Then he asked, Are you still under arrest? Everybody's too busy with the flood to notice me right now. How's your dad? Are they going to move him? The emergency generator can hold out for several days. They don't want to move him if they don't have to. I looked at his mother. Can you get back to the farm? Scott said, We don't know if the road is still open or not. I made it last night and I got you a change of clothes. The farm is on a rise in the forest and there's only a little fishing creek at the far end of the place. Violet said, I'm not sure they could spare anybody to try and make it back to the farm now, and if something went wrong and she had to evacuate, help would be too far away. I'm going to make sure there's a space here, Scott said. I don't want her in some shelter if I can help it. We may all be in one before this is over, Violet said. I'll be fine, Mrs. Carpenter said. A woman came around a corner and hurried toward us. Her name badge identified her as hospital administrator. She said, They're starting to sandbag on the west side of the hospital. We need all the help we can get. Mrs. Carpenter said she could take care of herself and her husband. I changed into the clothes Scott had brought me, and Violet, Scott, and I hurried down the stairs. The west side of the hospital was the furthest away from where I'd found the sheriff's body. Bags, sand, earth moving. equipment, and hundreds of people worked purposefully. In the middle of a group of men stood Clara Thornton, making decisions and giving orders. Because of his groin injury, Scott was assigned to the less strenuous jobs. The creek ran along a small parkway on this side. All the houses and businesses on the far side of the creek were underwater. Because of the slope, the water had been forced away from the hospital. Now, however, the water was rising toward us. The barrier we had to create was at least 400 feet long. I joined a line of people passing sandbags to the new levee. All of us worked with the mindless enthusiasm of those with a purpose and a chance to be heroic. We might be saving a few buildings in an insignificant town, but these were people's homes, the hospital, and the businesses that people lived in, worked in, and cared about. At noon, word passed among the workers that the Walter filtration plant was safe for now. As a precaution, some were giving duty to fill every possible container with water. No one could predict if the water plant would last, and every drop was precious. At one, word spread that the 10-foot levee we were building wasn't enough. Another 5 feet were necessary. If not, more weariness gave way to total aching and beyond. You wanted to take a break, but it was impossible. Someone had thought to salvage all the bottled water and soft drinks from the grocery store before it was inundated. We drank sparingly. At 2, the rain stopped altogether. By 2:30, the sky was bright blue. People cheered the first rays of the sun. By 4 o'clock, we wished for any kind of cover from the painful brightness. The heat rose and the stench increased. At one point, I found myself on top of the levee, and they'd had to extend it on both ends by 200 feet. Slowly, the ends had begun to turn on themselves. Eventually, I thought we might totally encircle the hospital. There was a 10-foot ridge running several hundred feet along the east side of the hospital. Each end could meet that if we had to. If the water overtopped the ridge, we were all going to have to be rescued by boats. I flung down sandbags upon sandbags. The water was 6 feet below where I was standing. I looked out over the rushing water. Up and down the line, people were stopping and staring, and I followed their gaze. I saw a man sitting in a tree, holding a German shepherd in his arms. We watched the drama unfold. The water was 3 feet from his legs. Firefighters on a hook and ladder truck were trying to reach him. The fire truck was on a slight rise in the front yard of the last house, about to be inundated. About 200 feet from the far right of the levee, the way out was steered clear of water. They extended the ladder as far as it would go. It was 5 feet short of the man. The water was still rising rapidly, so the truck could go no further into the water and would have to move back itself if it and its rescuers couldn't save him in the next few minutes. I saw men speaking into portable phones and walkie-talkies. I assumed any boats nearby were already in use making other rescues. None appeared on the horizon. If the man was going to be saved, this was his last chance. The fireman at the far end of the ladder threw him a rope. The man in the tree tied the end around his dog and shoved the animal into the water. The man stepped further up into the tree. The branches swayed. He could go no higher up. The fireman pulled the dog to safety. Again, the rope was thrown. It fell short. The water reached the front wheels of the fire truck a third time, and the man caught the end of the rope. He tied it around his waist and hung on to the end. The fire truck pulled away, taking man and beast with them out of harm's way. We cheered and returned to work. At 6 o'clock, as they had at noon, people gave out sandwiches and cans of pop. We could drink half the can and were given a plastic cup with which to share our bounty with a neighbor for this feast. I found myself next to an African-American woman in her early 20s. We smiled at each other as we savored our food and brief respite. I bumped into Shannon and Hiram Carpenter about half an hour after this. He aimed a nearly full sandbag at my foot. I yanked it out of the way. Shannon sneered. Hiram glared at me, muttered, "Fuck you," and walked away. All that day, none of the other workers had chosen to respond positively or negatively to my presence. Plenty of time for hate after the flood. By the time night fell, one road still led out of the parking lot and connected us to the rest of the town. A report came that 5 feet of water was swirling around the courthouse. A helicopter flew over. We had a snake, alligator, and verminous critter patrol set up. Sightings had been made of all of the above. Plus, there was a fear of rabid animals. The water still rose, but at a slower rate. 3 shifts of workers were set up to alternate work during the night. Scott and I stood on the top of the levee and watched the full moon rise. The dark turned to soft gray, and silvery patterns flickered on the water. Stars shone brightly and reflected in the surface of the rushing torrent. "Is the farm okay?" "I don't know. I'd hate to see the house gone. We should be okay, but I'm not sure about Nathan's and Hiram's places. I haven't seen them to talk to them." "How is Violet?" "I think she left just before sunset to check on the library. The books should be safe. She was concerned about the building itself." "What did the lawyers say last night when you and Violet called them?" "Todd had it all lined up to get tons of media coverage down here. Some of the networks, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and he didn't know who all else were on their way. I'm sure they're covering the flood now." "And they have no way of getting into town anyway. Outside help isn't going to be concerned about saving my butt, while most of the countryside is trying to float to the Gulf." While Scott went to look in on his mom and dad, I tried to locate Cody to check on my official status. I couldn't find any officials to talk to. The boots I had been given were clunky and uncomfortable, but every bone in my body hurt, so sore feet were hardly noticeable. Violet found me at the entrance to the hospital. "Library okay?" I asked. "Water's at least 7 feet deep. Building is probably ruined. Thank God the books, computers, and files are safe." Hospital workers passed out blankets for those of us sleeping on the floor in the hallway or outside. Most everybody chose to sleep under the stars. The halls had begun to smell of sweat and lack of deodorant. Outdoors we had the smell of flood, but the air wasn't as close. A group of 9 and 10-year-olds walked around with spray cans of mosquito repellent. Scott reported that his father rested peacefully. His mother was napping on a couch upstairs, and his sisters on guard. He hadn't seen his brothers. Violet, Scott, and I found a patch of ground to sleep on. All the cars in the parking lot were filled with kids, bedded down on front and back seats. Trunks were open with infants placed carefully inside. I hoped it wouldn't start to rain. We'd all have to cram ourselves into the hospital. A road was still open to the high school, but reports said it was already filled to capacity with refugees. I still had no watch or identification, all lost in the destruction of the jail. The cement of the parking lot gave not an inch in my attempts to find a comfortable position and fall asleep. Violet and Scott began reminiscing. I thought of making sure I lay between them, and then I thought I'd better grow up and get a life. I listened to them talk softly of warm nights like these in summers long past, of whispered secrets that now seemed remote and comfortable. They spoke of teenage tragedies, couples who broke up, people they wished they still knew, people they were glad they hadn't seen in years and hoped never to see again. The moon was almost directly overhead. The gray light was enough to show one crew working at the far end of the levee closest to the ridge. Another team was filling sandbags near the center where we had started that morning. Watchers walked the top of the levee. I lay on my back and gazed at the stars. Scott and Violet talked about the time they were king and queen of the senior prom. "I was so proud to walk down the center of the gym with you," Scott said. "I was just terrified that you'd expect something later." Violet laughed. "You don't know how desperately I wanted something later." They both chuckled. Someone shouted from the far side of the parking lot. In seconds, people were up and running toward the levee. Water rushed through a 3-foot gap in the dike. Every second it grew wider. People raced to help. Lines formed quickly. Sandbags flew. I found myself between a hunky teenager and a woman in her 50s with enormous breasts and huge arms. They handed us sandbags from our right, and from our left, water poured into us. The woman, the teenager, and I competed with at least 40 other hands, slinging bags of sand into the breach. Water sluiced around us. Someone shouted, "Move back! It's going to go! Run!" I whirled my head around. No one around me retreated. The water was up to my waist. People on top of the dike hurled sandbags from the sides. 20 of us were right at the opening. I turned for another bag, and something bumped into my left hand. When I looked down, I saw moonlight glittering on the bloated, no longer handsome face of Jasper Williams. I called out, but my shout was lost in the uproar of desperate humans and rushing water. The huge woman and the teenager saw him. We paused for a second. The woman grabbed his hand for an instant. "He's dead," she said. Sandbags continued to rain down from above. The corpse wedged into the opening and provided an excellent break to a ton of water. The kid yelled, "We can get him later." The woman nodded. She shouted, "He hurt people when he was alive. Maybe he'll save a few now." We piled sandbags around on top of him. In seconds, his body was completely covered. Minutes later, the water from the break was down to a trickle, and finally it stopped. The woman said, "I want to get a hold of the dim-bulb dipshit who yelled, 'Run!'" The kid said, "It was that asshole Al Holcomb." I enjoyed the idea of him being the goat of the town. The woman and the kid promised to find someone to report the dead body to. I was just pleased that Jasper was really dead. I found Scott on top of the levee, helping reinforce another spot that looked weak. I figured he'd aggravate his injury, but there wasn't time to worry about that now. I lent a hand. When I stopped my work for the night, the moon was on the western horizon. Full dawn wasn't far off. Scott limped slightly as he and I wandered back to the hospital, climbed the stairs, and found his mom. She was awake. She had insisted that Shannon and Mary go out to help with repairing the dike. Scott and his mom went in to look at his dad. I sat on the couch and felt more tired than I had ever been in my life. Dr. McLarty poked his head in the door of the lounge. He wore jeans, boots, and a green t-shirt with Burke County General Hospital stenciled on the front. His clothes were as wet as anyone's I'd seen that day. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah. You at the flood?" "Just finished filling my millionth sandbag. They say the crest will be late this afternoon. The river isn't rising as rapidly. We might make it." He sat down. "I talked to some people," he said. "They think they might know some things to help you." "Who?" "Two lesbians, sir. Are you still in danger?" "I think I'm still arrested as soon as the sky stops falling. I'm afraid I'll be back in the tender hands of Burke County." I gave him a brief summary of what had happened at the jail. When I finished, he led me to a third-floor room near Dennis's. He told me Dennis would be able to leave the hospital in a day or two. "You should both be happy to be alive. I don't know if plastic surgery can repair what Jasper destroyed." I told him about the corpse. "Good. The town bully is dead." We entered an unoccupied doctor's office. Sitting in one chair was a grossly overweight woman of about 25. Next to her, and holding her hand, was a woman in her early 40s. She might have been a university professor, except, like the rest of us, her clothes were damp and she smelled like she'd been dipped in shit. She wore gold-rimmed glasses and had a quiet demeanor, holding herself properly, shoulders back. McLarty introduced them as Sylvia and Janice. Sylvia, the professorish one, said, "I own a shop on Main Street on the square. I managed to move most of my inventory. I make dresses." And Janice said, "I'm part owner of the Dixie Square Beauty Shop." I couldn't imagine her being much of an advertisement for her own products, but if they were willing to help, I was ready to pass out sainthoods and buy every article they sold in their stores. Maybe even fly in for haircuts once in a month. Whatever it took. Janice said, "Dr. McLarty urged us to help you. We're a little uncertain. We have to live in this town. I promise I won't bring your names into any of this." The women looked at each other, then over at McLarty. Sylvia said, "We have to be very careful. We're the only two lesbians in the area who own shops, and we aren't out in the open. If word got around, the least that would happen is our store windows would be broken. If there is anything left to break after this disaster." Again, I promised to keep them out of it. Janice said, "We have a small women's group from the surrounding counties." "Magnolia from the bar mentioned one," I said. "Yes, we're a subgroup. It's very informal. Magnolia is so tough and nothing seems to scare her." Is she a lesbian? She says she's open-minded, Janice said. Some nights she prefers one, some the other, mostly none. What's important, Sylvia said, is that we know something was supposed to happen this week. We aren't sure what. Who was planning to act? Those women whom the sheriff had victimized. Some of them told word got back to the clan. Supposedly they were going to try and organize something at their meeting. Didn't the noble male giving his all for the honor of southern womanhood go out with Gone with the Wind? No, Janice said. So he said, what the sheriff was doing was despicable. Why not go to the police, I asked, and realized instantly it wasn't the brightest question. Then I asked about other jurisdictions, other judges and lawyers. A woman would have to prove it. There was no physical proof, no evidence. Who were the women and men involved? I asked. We only know some of them, Janice said, and at least one was in the clan, so he could ask for them to take action. Who were they? I asked. There were three. Jennifer Essex, the wife of Harvey Essex, one of the policemen on the force, young blonde fellows. I saw him questioning you the morning of the murder, McClarty said. Betty Dixon told her brother Chad she's only 18 and not married. They hesitated. Who's the third? McClarty said. Shannon Carpenter. Hiram was probably the one who was going to bring it to the clan for action. They knew only those names and that something was supposed to happen. They knew no more and didn't want to prolong the interview. They seemed to want to run as fast as they could in the other direction. After exacting another promise for me not to say anything about them, they left. I decided it would not be helpful to tell Scott about this latest revelation. I was dismayed, but not surprised that his family was in this deeply. I left the hospital in the parking lot. The assigned crews were continuing to fill sandbags and stack them at key points. Many people were lined up at Red Cross coffee machines. The sun was already beginning to warm the fetid air. I searched the crowd for any of the people mentioned. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.